Today, we will be discussing the different types of custom data structures one can build inside decisions. While decisions offer several data structures out of the box, they might not necessarily provide all the fields or features one would need to capture. Here is where creating a custom data structure might be necessary. So this chart that we see here gives us a very nice visual representation of the data structures inside decisions. It's actually a selection matrix, which breaks this down into the features that each data structure provides to the user. The labels at the top represent the types of custom data structures or containers that are available in decisions. These are all used to help organize, maintain, and store data throughout the workflow. A few things to consider when selecting a data structure would be the first one, complexity. From this chart, we can see that the data structures that are in gray are not as complex as the ones in blue. People typically find themselves building data structures within the gray area. So an entity or a flow structure or a database structure, these are the common database data structures that people typically use because they're not so complex, but they provide a good, a good selection of features. We also want to consider whether or not this database, the data structure can save to a database. Now, this is important when you need your data to persist and you want to be able to retrieve this data and later on report on the data. Some data structures have the option to generate flow steps that allow you to save the data inside the database. So that is something that needs to be considered when selecting a data structure for use. You also want to think about whether or not the data structure has a configuration folder. Now, these configuration folders provide an additional layer that creates a place for a user to add more functionality to the data structure. So for example, let's pick an entity. We'll discuss that in much detail later on. But an entity allows one to create custom actions, which are called using a right-click action on the entity, for example. You could also create a rule inside a configuration folder of the entity that would be applied to the entire entity. Let's talk about the entity framework. Decisions can manage additional fields for some data structures like created on date, created by, modified date, location in the portal, what folder ID contains, and so on. The entity framework provides an extended list of fields that automatically get tracked by decisions and which do not need to be maintained by the user. That's very helpful when you later on realize that you might need some of these metadata to know. It really just helps with things like an audit trail, for example. You want to know who created what, when they created it, has it been modified? Sometimes when things happen and you might not necessarily consider all the scenarios where data could get corrupted. So it helps to know that you can go in later on and check to see if it's been modified, when it was modified, and all information like that. We want to think about folder behavior. Some data structures exhibit folder behavior, meaning they act like folders, and they would exist within the folder tree in decisions. So they're easier to find because they're part of the folder tree. That's a really cool feature to have, and we'll talk about that later. You also want to think about process tracking. Process tracking means that the data structures will automatically save data about an executing workflow. Sometimes this is necessary, sometimes it comes in handy. It really just depends on your specific use case. I'm going to start talking about these, starting with the value list. This is an easy easy data structure to use. Value list is an enumerated list of strings. Once created, you may access them from any flow. Basically a drop-down list, which is used. So think about a drop-down list on a form, for example. So the example I have here is an address form, which allows a user to input their state by selecting from a drop-down list of all 50 states in the US. Next up, we have our flow structure. Flow structure is used for organization in a flow. It is a container that is used to leverage data inside of the workflow and to pass it between workflows. There is no way to save the data captured in a flow structure into a database. A flow structure has no configuration folder, and it cannot be reported on because the data does not persist. So there's nothing to retrieve and then report. So a good use case would be collecting credit card information and passing the data from flow A to flow B and from flow B to a form, for example. So the credit card flow structure will have a credit card number, the CVV code, which is the 3 or 4 digit code found on the back or the front of your credit card. It would have the credit card manufacturer, which could be Visa, Discover, MasterCard, and it would have the credit card expiration date. So while this information would never be stored in a database, it would be easy to refer to the customer credit card from the workflows. Next is a database structure. Now, a database structure, it basically defines an object that is stored in a database. It exists only in the database, not in the portal, like an entity or a folder extension, not by default at least. But because the data persists in a database, it can be reported on and have actions built into it if the configuration folder is turned on. So that's an additional setup that needs to happen so that you can get some of these features that the configuration folder provides. The database structure has all the features of a flow structure, but it generates additional steps to allow us to save and manipulate the data inside a database using CRUD actions. CRUD actions, for those of you with a programming background, that is create, read, update, and delete actions. So we want to create a new database structure. We want to read from the database structure. We want to update. We want to delete it. Data is not saved automatically. So just because it's called a database structure does not mean that everything that runs through it is going to get automatically saved. There are steps that are provided in decisions to make sure that the data persists. So you would need to use these database structure steps, the CRUD steps, to help save the data into your database. Since the data is stored in the database, reporting is available on data structures, and database structures track a few additional fields by default, but do not necessarily provide all the features of the entity framework. I'm going to talk about the least database structure, even though it's not here, before I get into the entity. I just want to quickly brush on that. A database structure least, it applies to a very specific use case. Now, it is technically a database structure, but it's less commonly used than other data structures. It is useful when there are multiple application servers hitting one decisions database that's storing a very large amount of records. In this scenario, it is possible to safely process the large number of records through decisions with many application servers and many flows hitting one database using a least structure. Since the least database structure is able to lock or lease rows as they are being processed out of the database, several application servers and flows may hit the same database at the same time without database contention. So when a line in the database or when a row in the database is being processed, that row is locked and is made unavailable to any other service or any other processes that are trying to access the same database. So only one application server can access one row at a time, but there is enough capacity for different servers to access the same database. They just take turns locking and releasing the rows as they go. That's just something I wanted to point out, that's an additional database structure option that Decisions provides. Next up is our entity. Entities do not have folder behavior. It's one thing that I should put out there, but they can be stored in the folder and viewed from the portal. Isn't that interesting? They're similar to a database structure in the sense that they provide the database steps in order to build, save, and maintain it using CRUD actions with a workflow. However, an entity provides additional fields that aren't part of a database structure, such as created by, created on, and modified date. You also get the added benefit of a configuration folder, so you can write your own custom actions and write your own custom visibility rules. Again, the entity can be added to a portal. So entities are, they're great for a lot of use cases that require more tracking and specific user actions that you probably will not get by default in Decisions. So an example of an entity is a person. A person would have data fields like age, clothing size, etc. The values can change, but the person always remains a person. Now let's talk about an external entity. An external entity is an entity, and it behaves exactly like an entity, but it does not live inside Decisions. Does that make sense? It lives outside of Decisions, but we can make reference to it and treat it exactly like a Decisions object. So it would allow a user to build actions, same as with an entity, and report on external data, such as the result of an API call or an external database. After creating the external entity, a list of flows will be generated inside the configuration folder. So the external entity allows a user during creation to define the source of record through an additional setup piece in order to create CRUD actions to whatever the system of record is. It's a fascinating data type. We have the entity extension. This is basically, like the name sounds, an extension of an entity. It allows a user to add additional fields to the entity by adding a new database for the additional fields or additional functionality. It exists on its own, but it's a new type with additional fields. However, it is linked to the original entity through the database. So the entity extension is considered to be part of the original entity because of that linkage. And so it will not have its own configuration folder. Next is a folder extension. A folder extension allows users to create a folder that represents an entity. That is an entity with folder behavior. Users can store additional objects in the portal visible folders. So a folder extension will provide the look and feel of an entity. So it lives in the portal, CRUD steps are created, there is additional out-of-the-box tracking, and it exists as a folder in Decisions. Next is the flow execution extension. So here we are getting to the more complex parts of our data structures. A flow execution extension behaves similarly to an entity and folder extension. It provides CRUD actions through steps. It saves into the database. It creates a configuration folder for additional capability, tracks additional fields about the data. It lives in the portal. It has folder behavior. And last but not least, it stores process tracking information. This is a lot. This means that a folder execution extension is going to be tied to the execution of a flow. And as that flow runs, it's going to save process data into this flow execution extension folder. So we have an example here, an employee application with data to save and refer to later, such as the applicant name or the resume PDF, for example. So you can always save it, go back to it, pull it out, report on it, create new ones, delete, modify, whatever you want to do. A folder execution extension provides. And fun fact, it is the most commonly used data structure just because of how heavily involved it is as a data structure and how much functionality it provides right off the bat. Last but not least is our case entity. A case entity behaves like a flow execution extension. So everything I said about the flow execution extension, and then some, but it's used in non-standard or non-linear processes. So a flow execution extension is best for linear processes. So you go from submitting your application to application review to application approval and then completion. Whereas for the case entity, you could go from submission to review, back to submission because maybe you forgot to include something in your application. So during the review, the application just kind of gets sent back for additional input. So that's when the case entity would be used for non-linear processes. So if the process is likely to bounce from point A to point B, back to point A, then jump to point C, then in that case, you would heavily consider using a case entity. It is a folder-based data type, has multiple states that can actually be defined, so you can create your own custom states for a case entity. Like I said, it's not limited to following a linear process, move from one state to any other state. The case editor, which is a very handy tool that comes with the case entity, allows users to define actions that apply to each state. The folder type behavior allows users to build dashboards or store other data such as entities or assignments. A patient record case tracking states such as inquiry, booking an appointment, assessing a patient. It can have varying outcomes. So, your case entity is a fantastic tool for nonlinear processes. So having done that, I want to show you how you can create some of these data structures inside Decisions. Looking at the Decision Studio, I created a beginner training folder to host a lot of the things that I'm creating, a lot of the decisions objects that I will be creating for this training. Up at the top, we see a few options to create several decisions objects. What we are looking for is to create data types and integration. So I'm going to click that. Here we see the list of everything we talked about. So we see our value list, we see our database structure, we see our flow structure, external entity, entity extension, folder extension, case entity, flow execution extension. And then we have additional options here, which will be covered in other classes. But to create a flow execution extension, for example, or any of these data structures, you would click on it, and then Decisions gives you the opportunity to name your data structure. So I'm going to call this person. And then provide fields for that person. I'm going to say name, going to have date of birth. These names cannot have spaces between them. So the minute I hit space, the validation popped up. So we're going to have date of birth, which is of type date time. I will also have street 1, that is for street address 1 as a string, and street 2, which can be optional. And then we have our city, zip, and we hit save. Decisions will create this data structure for us right here. And it creates a configuration folder, just like we talked about. Once that is done, you have access to go into your configuration folder where you can create custom user actions. You can create trigger flows. You can create a diagram tile for your flow execution extension, and you can also generate descriptions. You can create action visibility rules. So these are all additional actions or functionality that can be created inside the configuration folder. As you can see, they are not provided by default. So I can create a user action for a group or an individual user action where you would right click and select the user action name. So to create a user action, again, you would give this a name. And I can spell. And you have the option of picking a template, but you can just hit create, and that will drop you into your user action flow. In this case, the edit person flow. Now, for the flow execution extension that I created, that would be found under a user defined type, since I am the one that created it. And it would be found under flow data extension. So here is that person that I created. And these are the CRUD actions that are generated by decisions when that person is created. So you can delete the object. You can check if the object exists. You can fetch all of them, which means that if you create the person, you can actually go back and retrieve the person by the ID and by a bunch of other, let me expand this so you can see, by the process folder ID, by the process tracking ID, unique process ID, you can get a count, you can edit a copy, you can save. And these actions are not the same for every data structure. So every data structure has a different list of actions that can be created. Now, while a lot of them like delete and fetch all, some of them refer to it as get all, edit and save are very similar. There are some like this fetch by process tracking ID or unique process ID that are unique to the flow data extension, or would be unique to a data structure that is created. So if I let's assume that I finish this flow and I save it and I get out, now I have a user action here that can be triggered from a report. So I would just right click on the person report, and I would be able to edit a person through that action. That's just one type of a data structure. I can also create a database structure just because I want to show you the list of actions that would be created, the list of CRUD actions that would be created with a database structure and how it differs from the flow execution extension. So here I have address. I'm going to have street 1. I'm going to have street 2, the city, the state, and the zip code, all strings. the street to. We should always allow null because not everybody has an apartment or suite ID or something. And then we hit save. So the database structure has now been created, and that is right here under simple data structure. As you can see, there was no configuration folder created for the database structure because it does not have that, that functionality. But if I click into this, I can generate a form that would actually use the fields inside that database structure to just create a generic form. I can edit, I can delete the database structure, I can create a management folder, I can do a list of things. Now, if I go into a flow, for example, let's say I create a flow. Call this address flow and hit create. I can go here into the user defined types and the database structures. It's going to show me that address that I created. Now here you notice that the CRUD actions are different. Here you can create, delete, edit, get a specific address by its ID. You can get all the addresses. You can do a selective update, which is when you update certain fields inside the database structure without overwriting the other fields. So if I select one of these steps, let's say I want to create a database structure, that's going to pull up this properties panel on the side for that create address step. Now for item to create, it has an address here. You would be able to pick to select from flow if you had another address item in here. But since we don't, what we can actually do is build data. So when I expose those data members, you now see that all the fields that I created for the address database structure now appear in here, and you can choose, you can choose constant types to put in there and just so why don't I just leave it here? And then once I connect the done step to the end step and I run this, it will create that address that I just gave it, give it an entity ID. So here, I didn't provide a street address or a zip code. So it just kind of skipped over that and created the entity the way I asked it to. Now, if I were to pull out all the addresses that have been created inside the database, for example, and I went into debug, it would give me that address that I just created right here. So these database structures allow data to persist in a database, which is great when you know that you would later need to retrieve this information. Creating databases or data structures inside decisions is the same process. You create a data type or integration, you select the type that you want, and then you define it however you need to define it, set the properties the way you want it, and then you would save, and the database structure or the data structure is going to get created for you in decisions along with a configuration folder if it's a type that requires a configuration folder. This brings us to the end of this lesson. Please let me know if you have any questions and I will be happy to address them.